There we go. Okay. This is the aerial photograph of Malian, very, very famous, of course. The TUV mound is in the bottom of the picture, and the main area of occupation, the Banesh and Kaftari cities, is up in the top, surrounded by the city wall. This is the chronology of what we're working with at Malian. It was from Pierre de Mirochegi in the Festschrift for William Sumner. And one of the reasons that I am using it today, and I like it, of course, I think that he captured all the relationships correctly, but he also shows a gap between the Banesh and the Kaftari. And that's one of the focuses of my discussion. It's where I'm going to start talking, and then look at the Banesh era city and at the Kaftari era city. I'm basing everything that I say on work that was done a long time ago, except for the neutron activation analysis of pottery from the Kur River Basin. And the question I want to begin with is there a Banesh-Kaftari gap? The slide is a review of the history of where the idea of a gap came from. And in the end, to try to resolve that question, or at least learn more about it, in 2004, Kamyar Abdi and I dug a 2x3 meter sounding in the H1 square at Malian. We wanted to get a better ceramic sample from that era and find out if there was a gap in the occupation, a gap in the ceramic sequence, or if there was some level of continuity between them. So that was the focus of our work there. And this shows why Sumner thought there was a gap. This is the ABC South section, and this level right here, level 7, right there, is a very well-developed erosion surface. It has gravel and pebbles on the top. It looks like a deflationary surface. And below it, there is Banesh pottery, middle Banesh pottery, there's no late Banesh there. And above it is middle Kaftari or main Kaftari pottery. So the ABC excavation shows a gap that probably, was 800 to 1,000 years, where there was no occupation in that part of Malian. There is also a gap in the radiocarbon dates. This is from Cameron Petrie's paper on radiocarbon dating from the Arcana study. And it shows that there is a very clear gap of about 400 years when there's no evidence, according to the radiocarbon chronology, of any occupation at Malian. Here's where we're talking about this. Here's the ABC excavation right there, where there's that clear erosion surface and chronological gap. GHI, there was Bill Sumner's H5 deep sounding that was published by Miller and Sumner in 2004. And between the two of those is the H1 sounding. These loci are less than 100 meters apart. They're really quite close to each other. It's 70 meters from H1 to the south side of ABC. And when we dug the H1 sounding, we didn't find any stratigraphic break at all. This is the sounding, and here is the chronological assignment of layers based on the ceramics in there. So the H1 sounding goes from Lake Banesh at the bottom through a series of Banesh-Kaftari transitional layers. There is an early Kaftari layer, which is rubble from some kind of a major construction. And then there is the main Kaftari or middle Kaftari, from the Sukulma era pottery that we're all so familiar with. Sometimes pottery is not much fun. It doesn't tend to give us really clear answers, and it can be very frustrating working with pottery. This is a moment of my recent life in the world of archaeological ceramics. So at H1, there's no stratigraphic break. There is no stylistic break between the Banesh and the Kaftari style pottery. Down here, we have late Banesh shown in purple, and they overlap. The distribution of late Banesh pottery overlaps with the Banesh Kaftari traditional or transitional, which is shown in dark orange. And that overlaps with the early Kaftari and the ceramic types which are typical of late Kaftari or middle Kaftari or whatever we want to call it. I'm calling it main Kaftari because there really isn't a late Kaftari, but that's a provisional term that I'm not convinced is going to be too useful. This diagram, to me, shows ceramic continuity. There are no real evident stylistic gaps here. And now I'm going to briefly go down and look at some of the pottery that we're talking about. This is late Banesh grit-tempered pottery. On the right is a slide from the BY8 excavation that Sumner did on the Malian city wall. And on the left-hand side are drawings of the late Banesh grit-tempered from the H1 sounding. And then we look at Banesh Kaftari transitional black on red. It's a combination of grit and chaff temper, and that's probably the most distinctive characteristic of the ceramics of the Banesh Kaftari transition. There are some carinations on the jar shoulders, as you can see up here. That's not something that I recognize from either the Kaftari or the Banesh period very much. Thin and well fired, but the design elements are very familiar from main Kaftari black on buff pottery. And the surface appearance of the pottery with the black paint over a matte red slip is reminiscent of a lot of early Kaftari pottery in particular. So it has a distinctive paste, but design elements and technical elements of slip and painting that we see regularly in later Kaftari period ceramics. Banesh Kaftari transitional, meaning it has that combination of grit and chaff temper. Black on buff painting. This sherd right there is that vessel right there. And only some of the pieces of illustrated ceramics are black on buff. They're all identified in that little text that you can't read. Banesh Kaftari transitional unpainted. This one is pretty distinctive. And I think that this particular form of bowl is a very good chronological indicator for this period. Sumner found one in the H5 sequence. I found several of them in the H1 sequence. And it's a pretty distinctive shape. Other shapes, particularly these jar necks, run through the whole Kaftari, into and through the entire Kaftari sequence. So some familiar shapes, different surface treatment, different temper and paste, and some shapes and forms that may be chronologically distinctive. I don't have a picture of the grit tempered matte red slip, but it's pretty obvious what that is all about. And then we get to the early Kaftari period pottery, and the real distinctive set of decorations are this burnished red slip, the painted burnished red slip. It's got black paint, it's got a burnished red slip, it's got a grit temper, but it doesn't have the chaff added to it that you have during the Banesh Kaftari transitional. In here, there's a lot of elements that we see later on. The small fine line painting is reasonably distinctive of the period. The meanders are sharp and angular, but the bow ties are something that's familiar in Kaftari. The tree of life is familiar in Kaftari. This is what Sumner meant when he said, as near as I can tell, when he described Kaftari red, he was talking about this. He comments that Kaftari red had a grit temper, and he talks about the painting on it. But there's also a Kaftari matte red slip. It's on chaff tempered. It has the same kind of black on red design that we saw in the grit tempered version of this in the Banesh Kaftari transitional. It's got the same old horizontal lines. It's got the same rolled or thickened or clubbed rims, however you want to call it. One distinctive form is the canteen, and we'll talk about canteens more later. And they're always the matte red slip, painted matte red slip. So this is the main Kaftari, and the paste here, the paste of matte red slip, is very much like the paste of black on buff Kaftari painted pottery. So a new style of paste that we hadn't seen before, but similar shapes to earlier eras and similar decorative motifs to earlier eras. Okay, and here's the unpainted matte red slip, which really, in terms of just looking at the pottery, looks very much like the painted, except it doesn't have black paint on it. The paint is not fugitive. The black paint is not fugitive. So they really were not painted. It's not that we just can't see the paint anymore. And here is before I go any further, I should say, when Nickerson was talking about Kaftari red, he combined burnished black on red and matte red slip. He called both of them Kaftari red. So Sumner was calling one thing Kaftari red. Nickerson was calling another thing Kaftari red. And it's hard to keep straight what people are talking about here sometimes. I think by dividing it up and by looking at the temper, one gets a better idea of what's going on here. Then there's an odd type. It's fine paste painted buff. This has all the elements that we would expect in design motifs in Kaftari buffware, particularly the left-facing Kaftari birds. But the paste is really different. The paste is, it doesn't have chaff temper. There's not much grit in it at all. It's a very solid, well-fired, high-quality kind of pottery. Standard main Kaftari designs, but a different paste entirely. This may be what Vandenberg was calling Calais. I'm not sure. I have a hard time puzzling out much of Vandenberg's work. It does seem to be contemporaneous with the rest of the Kaftari pottery. And this set of drawings at the bottom of the page are the fine paste painted buff pottery. Up above are black on buff Kaftari. And so you can compare the birds. There are differences, the open eyes and not, but a less open eye, the little fat-bodied bird with that funny tail. There's an enormous set of variations in the birds, and somebody at some point is going to have a lot of fun dealing with it. Fortunately, it's not going to be me. Okay, so the next slide is chaff-tempered painted buff. This is main Kaftari. This is the diagnostic stuff that we find on the surface of a site, and you can immediately identify it as Kaftari. The chaff temper helps you distinguish it from particularly Bakun pottery that might have small sherds of it, might be confused because of their design elements. But it's got many of the themes that we saw in transitional pottery, with these angular, wiggly lines, panels of vertical or diagonal stripes. There's the diagonal stripes. Instead of solid areas, diamonds and bow ties and things, often they'll be cross-hatched. In any event, it's elements of the design repertoire that we've seen before. So in ceramics, it doesn't look like there's a clear gap. There's not a clear break in the pottery, at least in the evidence that we have from sounding H1. That's different from what we see in the ABC excavation. So there's two areas here. There's the notion that there is a gap between Banesh and Kaftari, and there's the notion that there is no gap. And in fact, there is a continuum of possibilities between here. I don't think anybody says there is a complete absence of population in the Kura River Basin during that gap. I don't think anybody says that there's a large settled population in the Kura River Basin during that period. But the focus of it, the words that we use and the ideas that we come up with as a result of those words, do make a difference in how it's interpreted. There are good reasons for believing each thing. The survey, particularly Sumner's survey, but my survey as well, Sumner found nothing, no settlements in that gap. I found, on re-examining my data, one or two settlements other than Malian. Sumner, when he was initially talking about the relationship between Banesh and Kaftari, did not believe that there was any transitional occupation in Malian. And I, having dug the H1 sounding, believed that there was a population during that era in Malian. But people who talk about a gap say there's no obvious connection between the ceramics, that Banesh pottery really does look very different from Kaftari pottery. If you don't have the sequence of transitional forms and techniques that occur. If you think there's a gap, it's easy to conclude that there is no connection between Proto-Elamite and Elamite writing. In fact, you would say Proto-Elamite is something entirely different. You might suggest that there are new populations that occupy the Kura River Basin, that the Banesh peoples abandon it and that new Kaftari peoples move in. And if you believe that, or you suspect that, you might say that the new group has a new form of economic organization, a new social system, a new political system. Sumner was definitely toward this end of the continuum. And I think Pierre de Mirochegi, and who's here and can correct me if I'm wrong, is probably on this side of the continuum as well. Jacob Dahl and Dan Potts, again, I feel would put themselves on the gap side of the continuum. If you think there is no gap, you would conclude that there is a connection between the eras of Proto-Elamite writing and Elamite writing. it's something that you would look for links rather than looking at a sharp break. You would suspect that there is a switch in emphasis from settled agriculture to pastoralism, and then back with settled agriculture during the Banesh, pastoralism during the Gap, and settled agricultural production during the Kaftari. Sumner talked about this as well. Sumner couldn't decide where he fit in this, and he went back and forth. Again, if you think there is no gap, you might suspect that it's the same ethnic group living in the region for 1,000 years, with a flexible social and political organization that let them accommodate a switch between the agricultural and pastoral economies. That idea I took from Abbas Alizadeh, as everyone here will recognize. Francois Dessat talks about the connections, possible connections between Proto-Elamite and Elamite. And for me, I'm looking mainly at the pottery. So if there is a gap, then you think entirely different things about what might be going on in the Kure River Basin than you would if you don't believe there's a gap. So here, this is for you, Vince Piggott. The entire problem, gap or not, arose because of an accident of excavation. And I am blaming that on Vince Piggott. In H1, there is no clear stratigraphic break. In ABC, there is a very clear stratigraphic break between the two periods. And the reason that this is Vince's fault is that when Bill Sumner was trying to figure out where to dig at Malian, I am told, and you can correct me, Vince, that they took Vince Piggott up to a rise in the middle of the site. They blindfolded him, and they turned him around and around and around in a circle, and they gave him a stone or a sherd, and he threw it. And where that sherd landed was the origin, the 0 point in the Malian grid system, and that's where Bill put ABC. So you can blame Vince for giving us the gap in the occupation of the Kure River Basin. On the other hand, you can thank Vince for discovering the largest and most important Proto-Elamite building in Iran. So it may be Vince's fault that we have a gap, but it's also Vince's fault that we know so much about the Banesh occupation of Malian. Now it's time to look at Anshan, and I'm calling it a settlement because I don't want to prejudice the argument, is it a city or is it not? And I'm going to look at two periods, Middle Banesh, the Proto-Elamite settlement, major population center, according to Dr. Sardari's new estimates, about 78 hectares. And I would say it really looks like a city. This is a big place. It's got fancy buildings. It's got high quality stuff coming out of the archaeology. But it's not in the midst of a tiered settlement size hierarchy of regional sites. There are no sustaining settlements surrounding Proto-Elamite Malian. And the occupation at Malian looks like a cluster of discontinuous settlements. It doesn't seem to be a unified group. It looks like there's real borders within the city itself between different groups. In the main Kaftari period, about 2000 to 1600 BC, what we could call the Sukulma settlement. This is, again, a major population center. According to new estimates, about 113 hectares, so significantly bigger than the Banesh city. Again, it looks like a city. It's the center of a tiered site size hierarchy within the region. There are surrounding settlements that would sustain the population of the center. It has a major city wall around it. And it looks like a more or less continuous occupation. So now I'm going to review the settlement patterns and the site size distribution for each of those periods. And then I'm going to move on and look at the ceramics in terms of their compositions. So this is a quick thing. Everybody has seen these before. Banesh period, initial, the Lapui Banesh transition, scatter of very small sites in the western end of the valley. In the early Banesh, the sites cover a much smaller area. And again, they are mainly small sites. Middle Banesh, Malian appears. It's a great big site, but there's nothing around it. All these tiny little settlements right in the neighborhood. And in fact, these tiny little settlements kind of seem to be avoiding the central city. It's like they don't want to be too close to those guys. And the late Banesh, a very similar kind of distribution that's going on there. So there's dramatic growth of Malian during the middle over here, and late Banesh. Again, Dr. Sardari's work will improve these maps considerably. And the distribution in site size, which is a very good cognate for the population of the entire region. Lapui Banesh, you've got 10 sites covering 14 hectares. Early Banesh, you have 8 sites covering 14 hectares, plus a 6-hectare center at Malian. Middle Banesh, and this is again my old data, you have 10 hectares of peripheral settlement and a central settlement that's, we now think, about 70 hectares in size. And in late Banesh, you have even fewer peripheral sites, even smaller peripheral sites, and a city that's probably around, according to new estimates, probably around 50 hectares. So there's a dramatic growth in the size of the center, and there is a dramatic reduction in the area of peripheral settlement around the central place. This graph shows the size of the middle Banesh city up here. There's the late Banesh city, so these are not contemporaneous. The small towns are early Banesh, so they wouldn't be there. This would be the early Banesh settlement distribution. This and this would be the middle Banesh, the two ends, and the late Banesh would be that and something like over there. Now we look at the Kaftari settlement distribution, and it's completely different. This map is based on data from Bill Sumner's surface surveys, so it doesn't separate early Kaftari and main Kaftari. That means that the map represents 600 to 800 years worth of settlement on one little map. So approach it with some caution. However, it's pretty clear that we have a city or a big central place right there. It's not centrally located, but it's the dominant site within the region. There's a series of towns, and they're shown in the little bullseyes. I'm trying to get my arrow back. There, 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 and there. And then villages and hamlets. And these little sites with the open circles are sites we don't know how big they might be. Yeah, here. This is the histogram of Kaftari period settlement sizes. Malian down here is huge. There's nothing in between, and this is something that Greg Johnson called a primate settlement size hierarchy. But there are, contemporaneous with the occupation of the center, There are 6 little towns. There are a dozen villages, and there's 30 some hamlets. So there's a clear hierarchy in site sizes here. Very much a different pattern than we see in the Banesh. Now we go to the ceramics, and this is probably material that most of you are not familiar with. Leah Mink and I did a very large study of ceramics in the Kur River Basin. We analyzed, using neutron activation, a total of almost 800 sherds that came from Sumner's survey collections, came from the Malian excavation material, and it came from sherds in the H1 sounding. For the Kaftari period, there were somewhat over 400 samples, and there's 200 or so samples from the Banesh period. Neutron activation gives you a compositional fingerprint of a piece of pottery. And from there, we assume that that compositional fingerprint represents a clay source. When we can divide the compositions into clusters, we think that each of those clusters comes from a different source. And that tells us something about the production and distribution of ceramics. For the collection of all material from the Kur River Basin, we defined 5 macro groups of pottery. And you can see them. These compositional profiles show which elements distinguish which group, the groups one from another. So the high scandium aluminum, the ratio of scandium to aluminum has lower sodium, higher chromium, higher cobalt, low cesium, high strontium. You can read that following it. And these are thin sections or macro photography sections of each of a typical sherd from each of those compositional groups. And these are the other 2 groups. These 2 have typically more grit temper in them than the first 3 groups. And you can see that in the photomicrographs up above. That I believe that there is something in the high cesium grit temper that is producing they're really high in cesium. It's an unexpected concentration of cesium. I have no idea where this material came from. It's a puzzle to me to this day. And Leah Mink and I are working on it. So we'll try. There you can see the large, heavy grit temper, and it's these that are, I think, diagnostic of the cesium. Okay, there's some very clear temporal variation in the presence of different composition groups in the Kur River Basin. When you look at the Banesh, the high cesium, the green, is one of 2 dominant types, and the high aluminum group is the second type. That's very common. When you look at the Kaftari up here, the low aluminum group is the dominant group. It's also the dominant group in the Banesh-Kaftari transition, which is perhaps a clue that these 2 eras are more closely related than Banesh and Banesh-Kaftari transition. Kale has low chromium and thorium, and Shoga-Tameron, let's just ignore Shoga-Tameron for now. These are surface collections from the southeast end of the valley, and I think the regional clays available down there are different than the regional clays for the northwest side of the valley. But the importance of this map is that 80% of the Kaftari ceramics fall into the low aluminum group, and that the Banesh ceramics are more or less equally divided between the high cesium and high aluminum group. So there's the Kaftari. If we look at the Banesh ceramics first, this is the pattern that we found statistically. There's high cesium up here, very sharp division, no overlap at all. And there's low cesium down here, which are two groups, one of which is high aluminum content, one of which is low aluminum content. Aluminum is one of the major constituents in clay, so probably two different clay sources, one with a higher proportion of aluminum in it. And here's the figure that I think is significant. Those composition groups have a very distinctive pattern. From Malian, the high cesium group, 48 out of 52 high cesium sherds are found at Malian. The low cesium, low aluminum group, 16 out of 20 are at Malian. There's a real concentration of those two ceramic composition groups, and significantly, they're at Malian and not at other places. The miscellaneous Banesh are all those small settlements that we saw scattered to the north and east of Malian. They don't have the ceramics they don't have ceramics made of clays with the compositions that we're finding in Malian itself. No low cesium, no high cesium. Instead, they have the low cesium, high aluminum, which we think is being made at Tol-e Malian, where 34 out of 40, about, somewhere like 85% of the pottery is this compositional group. So Tol-e Malian is making pottery. They're distributing it to the miscellaneous Banesh sites, and some of it is going to Malian, but not very much. So this is in total about 20% of the pottery that's showing up at Malian that we tested is coming from Tol-e Malian or the area around Tol-e Malian. Tol-e Malian is making pottery for the peripheral settlements, but not for the main settlement. And the main settlement is making pottery that it's not sharing with anybody in the periphery. That's a pretty interesting pattern. So here are the interpretations. Tol-e Malian is, and some of the percentages. The focus here is that this is not the pattern we would expect for a major urban center. So Liz Carter said in her talk on Ancient Anshan, size alone does not make a settlement a city. Banesh era Malian is big, but it's not acting like a city, at least in terms of the ceramic economy. And in Kyle Olson's talk, he said the essence of urbanism, and I've messed up this quotation somehow. The essence of urbanism is intense social action, interaction, and the clusters of settlement character of Middle Banesh Anshan doesn't seem to indicate that there would be that kind of free and open community interaction at Malian. So my conclusion is Banesh period Anshan is not looking or acting like we would expect an urban center to act, and I think it's a big settlement, but not a city. Okay, that's strange. Let's look at the Kaftari city. During the Kaftari era, we had the main macro group is the low aluminum, the blue bars here. And from Sumner's survey collections, I was able to examine pottery from Kaftari kiln site. Here is Kamin. From Tol-e Malian, from Tol-e Bozorg, from Tepe Soz, and from Tepe Sia. They're all contemporaneous, we have reason to believe. We're looking at Kaftari pottery, and we see that the low aluminum macro group shows up in all of the sites, but it's much less common in the sites to the south of the Sivand River. So these three sites, Calais, Bozorg, and Soz, are predominantly the low chromium thorium group. That group is uncommon to the north and west of the Sivand River. It's present, but it's uncommon. And the high scandium aluminum group is, and other, which is pottery that doesn't fall easily into any of those clusters, are minor components of the ceramic assemblage at each of those sites. So then Leah Mink decided that she wanted to look at the low aluminum macro group and see if she could divide it up into subgroups. It didn't really work. You can look at it and say, yeah, there are several subgroups here, but using Mahalanobis statistics, which cluster them, the low aluminum macro group sherds are too similar to each other to divide statistically into four separate populations: low potassium, high sodium, low sodium, and low calcium. We can't separate them statistically, but visually they look different. And so let's see how they look in terms of their spatial distribution. Oops. These are the low aluminum subgroups during the Kaftari period. And once again, you can see that the low sodium is the dominant group at Malian, the yellow-orange group, dominant group at Malian, present in significant amounts at the Kaftari kiln site, but not found at all in the two sites near the confluence of the Sivand and Kur rivers. The Soz and Sia ceramics are dominated by the high sodium in the low aluminum subgroups. And the low calcium group is found at each of the sites, all of them. Again, how do we explain this pattern? I'm going to propose here, and this is, Leah Mink and I talked about this a lot, that the high sodium clays are being used to make Kaftari pottery at Tepes, Soz, and Sia. Low sodium clays are being used to make Kaftari pottery at Malian and the Kaftari kiln site. This pattern looks a little bit, so we're not finding the low sodium pottery manufactured in the Kaftari kiln site or in Malian. It's not moving out here to these two peripheral towns. Material from the peripheral towns is indeed moving to, and in small quantities, to Malian, but it's not moving back. This is, it's an interesting economic pattern that the center is extracting material from the peripheral sites, and it's not giving material back. Is there a temporal variation going on here as well? Again, we're looking at these low aluminum subgroups, and the data in this chart is all from the H1 sounding, where I've labeled the strata and the periods, and on the left-hand side you can see the proportions of the ceramics from each of those stratigraphic units that fell into each of the compositional groups. Low calcium declines steadily through time. Low sodium grows slowly through time until during the main Kaftari, it's the dominant compositional group present in the H1 sounding at Malian. During the period when Kaftari era Malian is most important, that's strata 2 and 3, right up here, you get the widest distribution of compositional types. So Kaftari era Malian is getting pottery from 5 different sources during the Sukulma period. In later periods, it's getting almost all of its pottery from the low sodium source. In earlier periods, it's not getting pottery from all of the sources. And in the Banesh Kaftari transitional, it's only getting pottery from 2 sources. So it's very localized acquisition of ceramics during the Banesh Kaftari transition, and a much greater variety of ceramics during the Sukulma era. So Sumner thought that Kaftari Canteens were a really good candidate of a distinctive pottery type that was produced in one place and distributed regionally. So he broke off little pieces of each of the canteens that we found in the excavations at Malian and brought them back to Penn for compositional sampling. They had never been tested, but Leah Mink and I were able to grind them up and put them in the reactor and look at their compositions. Interestingly, they were the low aluminum macro group. These are the macro groups, and the blue bars are the low aluminum. So the Kaftari canteens are coming from low aluminum sources, which are Malian, the Kaftari kiln, or Tepe Sia. In the Kaftari, that 13 of those low aluminum sherds were low calcium subgroup. Yeah, so these are the subgroups, and they are low aluminum, but they are low calcium, which is most frequent in the Tepe-Sos, Tepe-Sia area of the site. And it's quite uncommon in Malian in particular, and in the Kaftari kiln site as well. Yeah, the Kaftari canteens look like they're coming from the central part of the valley, and they're turning up in Malian. Again, there's nothing random about our sample, so it's hard to go too far with this. But certainly the canteens look like they were being made in one location and distributed throughout the valley. They have a very consistent style of design. They're a very consistent shape, and their composition with the low aluminum macro group, low calcium subgroup is reasonably distinctive, and it's not what is typically found at Malian. So I think Sumner would agree that the Kaftari canteens are being made in one or maybe 2 places and distributed, taken and used at Malian. This is what they look like in terms of their compositional profiles. And the canteens are the open black circles in the distributional chart up here. It looks, I think that this is pretty good. It's not something that we can defend using statistics and probabilities and assign a real number to, but certainly the pattern looks clear. So now I'm gonna review. We think we have these canteens being moved around. The neutron activation analysis told us these things, and we're summarizing that in chronology, high cesium, high aluminum groups are Banesh period, And the low aluminum macro group, the blue one, is the dominant group during the Kaftari period. So they're getting clays from different sources during those two periods. In terms of geographical variation, low aluminum is found in the western end of the valley. Low calcium to thorium ratio is found in the eastern side of the valley. These differences probably have to do with geological differences across the valley, and I assume that there is a clinal variation here with clays of different content being found in the western side of the valley versus what's found in the eastern side of the valley. During the Kaftari, there are 4 subgroups in the low aluminum macro group. And when we look at the distribution of those through space and time, we got some fairly clear patterns occurring within the region, with differences between what's found at Malian and what's found in the subsidiary towns and villages across the valley. Diversity of pottery at Malian increases during the Kaftari period as the site grows larger and more important. So the political importance of ancient Anshan is reflected in the diversity of ceramics found in the H1 sounding at the site. The distribution of the 2 subgroups seems to indicate that ceramics were moving from lower tier sites to the central site, but not as much from the center to the lower tier sites. And to me, this pattern implies a extractive economy rather than a market type or redistributive type economy. Again, if you've got an empire and a strong political center, you're going to get a lot of extraction occurring in your economic patterns. And the Kaftari Canteens seem to indicate production at 1 or maybe 2 locations, again, and then being moved to Anshan, again, hinting that the economy is somewhat extractive. So you put it all together, the settlement hierarchy, the scatter of sites across the valley, the evidence of ceramic economy. Kaftari era Malian looks like a city. So there you have it. That's it. There's, Malian is a city during the Sukulma era. It's an urban center. And Malian is a great big settlement without most of the characteristics of an urban center during the Banesh era. It's a sharp distinction, and it's a distinction that really surprised me when I put all the data together. I didn't expect them to be that different, but they are. So, concluding remarks. Thank you, Zara. Thank you for the previous speakers. Thank you, Dr. Sardari, for all your work. And other presenters have been regularly asked what should be done next. And I'm going to go ahead and pretend that someone asked me, and I'm going to give my answers. More survey and systematic survey, resurvey known sites, make good collections from them, and archive the collections in some way that they will be available to researchers 50 or 100 years into the future. Sites are being destroyed constantly, and the only records we will have from them will be those surface collections. 2, investigate the Banesh Kaftari transition through excavations at either or both of the small sites that seem to be occupied during the era. And 3, open excavations at some of the peripheral Kaftari sites. Tepe Sos, I think, was particularly important, and it does have tablets. And the Kaftari kiln site, which, if you want to investigate ceramic production, it certainly looks like that would be a wonderful place to do that. I've never seen the site, but it looks relatively undamaged in the Google Earth view of that part of the valley. And I think it'd be a very interesting place to dig. And finally, if you want to contact me, if you have suggestions or corrections to offer, email is the best way to get in touch with me.